Sir, look what they're doing.
Mafia
I see, it's just a little fun.
Fun? It's
Until a
chaos.
poor
All right,
single
boys, settle
mom
down now.
changed everything.
Sir, look what they're doing.
There is a
I
kind
see,
of
it's just a little
silence that
fun.
is louder
Fun?
than
It's
screaming.
chaos.
All right, boys, settle
It
down
lives in
now.
houses
Sir,
where
look
love
what they're
once
doing.
breathed and then
I see, it's
suddenly
just a little
stopped.
fun.
Fun? It's
It
chaos.
settles
All right,
into
boys,
the walls,
settle down now.
the curtains, the spaces between heartbeats, and it waits. It waits for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to break it. The Rossetti mansion sat at the edge of the city like a king on a cold throne. 7 floors of black marble and gilded iron. Security cameras that never blinked. Guards at every gate who never smiled. The kind of building that made ordinary people cross the street just to walk on the other side. Even the rain seemed to fall differently around it, harder, colder, as if the sky itself was afraid. Inside that mansion lived the most feared man in the entire city. Dante Rossetti. 35 years old. 6 feet 2 inches of controlled fury and ruthless intelligence. The kind of man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with equal amounts of dread. He had built an empire from nothing, from hunger and violence and a childhood that would have broken anyone else. He had enemies who had tried to destroy him 12 times. All 12 were no longer a problem. He wore his power like armor. Every room he entered became quieter. Every person he looked at became smaller. He had not laughed, truly laughed, in over 2 years. Because 2 years ago, Elena died. She was 32 when her heart gave out without warning. An undetected condition that no amount of money or power had been able to predict or prevent. She had been Dante's wife, yes. But more importantly, she had been the only warmth in the mansion. The only person who could walk into a room and make it feel like home simply by being in it. She left behind 3 children. Luca, 4 years old, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He had been old enough to understand that Mama was gone and she was never coming back. That understanding had turned him from a laughing, curious boy into a small, furious wall of defiance. He broke things. Not by accident. Sophia, 3 years old, with Elena's curly dark hair and a voice that could shatter glass when she screamed, which was often. She had been in the middle of learning to talk properly when her mother died, and something in her had simply stopped. She spoke now only when she wanted to wound someone. Her words, when they came, were sharp as knives for a 3-year-old. And little Marco, just 2 years old, the youngest, who barely remembered his mother but somehow felt her absence the most deeply. He cried at night with a desperation that had no words. He clung to anyone who came near him and then bit them when they tried to leave. Together, the Rossetti triplets were legendary. Not in the way children should be legendary, for sweetness, for funny things they said, for the way they mispronounced words and made adults melt. They were legendary the way storms are legendary. 17 maids in 11 months. That was the record. 17 women, all of them experienced, all of them professional, all of them absolutely certain they could handle 3 small children. None of them lasted more than 48 hours. The first one had her reading glasses flushed down the toilet by Luca within 6 hours of arriving. She left before dinner. The second had Sophia scream directly into her ear for 40 minutes straight until the woman's hands were shaking. She called a taxi at midnight. The third discovered Marco had somehow, at 2 years old, figured out how to lock her in the pantry. She resigned by slipping a note under the door. The stories grew more elaborate, more desperate, more chaotic after each departure. An agency in the city had eventually blacklisted the Rossetti household entirely. 2 other agencies refused to even take the call anymore. Dante's household manager, a pale and perpetually exhausted man named Mr. Ferretti, had developed a nervous twitch in his left eye that appeared every time someone mentioned finding new childcare. Dante himself dealt with his children the only way he knew how, with distance. He worked 18 hours a day. He paid for the finest nannies, the best toys, the most expensive clothes. He gave them everything except the one thing they were screaming for, in the only language broken children know how to use. They needed someone to stay. Not because they were paid to. Not because they were too afraid to leave. But because they chose to. Because the children meant something. What they did not know, what no one in that cold, gleaming mansion understood yet, was that the person who would choose them was not coming from an agency. She was coming from the other side of the city, from a one-room apartment with a leaking ceiling and an empty refrigerator, with a 4-year-old daughter on her hip and a job interview she almost didn't show up to because the bus fare nearly cleaned out her last few coins. Her name was Sophia. No, that was the child she would come to love. Her name was Aria Conti. 25 years old. Single mother. No connections, no savings, no safety net. Just a pair of steady hands, a heart that had survived its own breaking, and something quiet and unshakable in her eyes that no amount of hardship had managed to extinguish. She had no idea she was walking into a mansion haunted by grief. She had no idea 3 small, wounded children were waiting for someone exactly like her. She only knew that her daughter needed to eat tomorrow. And that this job, this impossible, terrifying, everyone has quit job, was the only one still available. So Aria Conti straightened her second-hand coat, took a slow breath, and rang the bell. The iron gate of the Rossetti mansion opened with a sound like a jaw closing. And everything, for all of them, was about to change. The interview room was designed to intimidate. Aria understood that the moment she sat down in the high-backed chair across from Mr. Ferretti, whose desk was large enough to park a car on. The walls were dark wood. The chandelier above her head probably cost more than her entire building. A portrait of Dante Rossetti hung on the wall behind the desk, stern, unsmiling, his dark eyes following her across the room the way powerful men's portraits always seem to. She folded her hands in her lap so no one would see them trembling. Mr. Ferretti looked at her the way a man looks at a bandage he's not sure is large enough for the wound. He was 50s, thin, with the permanently alarmed expression of someone who had long ago accepted that his life would never be calm again. "Miss Conti," he began, sliding a folder across the enormous desk. "I want to be transparent with you before we proceed." "Please," she said. "We have employed 17 caregivers in the past 11 months. None have remained beyond 48 hours. He paused, letting that settle. "The children are challenging." Aria looked at the folder. Inside were the profiles of Luca, Sophia, and Marco, ages, medical notes, behavioral observations. She looked at their photographs. 3 small faces, all dark-haired, all with the same jaw, all with eyes that looked older than they should. She had seen that look before. She saw it every morning in her own daughter's eyes, the shadow left behind when a parent disappears. Her daughter's father had not died. He had simply chosen to leave. But absence cut the same shape in a child's heart regardless of the reason. "Why did the last one leave?" Aria asked. Mr. Ferretti's eye twitched. "The eldest child, Luca, cut her braid off while she was sleeping. A lesser woman might have stood up right then." Aria pressed her lips together and nodded slowly. "He must have been very angry about something." Mr. Ferretti stared at her. "He cut off her braid." "Yes. Children that angry usually are angry about something specific." "Did anyone ask him what it was?" The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone says something so simple that it somehow sounds revolutionary. "The salary," Mr. Ferretti continued carefully, as though she had not just reoriented his entire understanding of the situation, "is substantial. You would live on the premises Monday through Friday. Your own daughter, I'm told from your application, is 4, she may accompany you during working hours only, as Mr. Rossetti has specified no permanent additional children in the residence. Arya nodded. She had already arranged for her neighbor, old Mrs. Benedetti, to watch her daughter Giada in the evenings when Arya would be working late. It wasn't ideal. Nothing about her life was ideal. But Giada was fed and safe, and that was the whole point. "When do I start?" Arya asked. Mr. Ferretti blinked. Most candidates, at this stage, had already started asking how quickly they could leave. "You don't have any further questions?" "I have many questions," she said honestly. "But I think the answers to most of them are in there." She touched her chest, not dramatically, just honestly. "I'd rather meet the children." She was given a tour of the children's floor, a sprawling wing of the mansion's third level that had been converted into a combination playroom, bedroom suite, and educational space. It was extraordinary in its expense and devastating in its emptiness. Every toy was top of the line. Every surface was spotless. There were no drawings on the walls. No handprints. No mess of the good kind, the creative, living, breathing mess of children who feel safe enough to make one. It felt like a museum of childhood, not a childhood itself. The children were brought in by a temporary daycare worker who looked like she was counting down the minutes until she could leave. Luca walked in first, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning Arya the way his father's portrait scanned the interview room, measuring, deciding, already suspicious. Sophia came in sideways, pressing her back against the wall, watching Arya with huge dark eyes that held something between rage and desperate hope, the eyes of a child who wants to trust someone and has been hurt too many times to risk it. Marco toddled in last, saw a stranger, and immediately burst into tears. The daycare worker took a visible step backward. Arya did not step backward. She lowered herself to the floor, right there on the expensive carpet, until she was at Marco's level. She did not reach for him. She did not make her voice high and false the way adults do when they want children to perform being comfortable. She just sat on the floor and said, quietly, "I know. New people are scary. You don't have to like me yet." Marco stopped crying. Not because he was happy, but because he was surprised. Nobody had ever said that to him before. Luca's eyes narrowed. He had a small scar on his chin from when he'd thrown himself off a chair 6 months ago in a fit of grief rage, and nobody had understood why. He looked at this woman sitting on his floor and his jaw set hard. "You're going to leave," he said. 4 years old, and his voice had the flat certainty of someone who had been proven right about this too many times. Arya looked at him. She did not promise she would stay forever, because she did not make promises she wasn't certain she could keep, and she had learned that children could detect a false promise the way dogs detect fear. "I'm here today," she said. "And I'd very much like to still be here tomorrow." It was not the answer Luca expected. He didn't know what to do with it. So he did what he always did when he didn't know what to do. He picked up the nearest object, a heavy toy truck, and threw it at the wall. The daycare worker gasped and grabbed her bag. Arya watched the truck hit the wall and leave a scuff mark. She looked at Luca. His chest was heaving. His fists were clenched. His eyes were wet, though he would have died before letting a tear fall. "That was loud," she said, calmly. "Did it help?" Luca stared at her. "What? Did throwing it make you feel better?" "No. It usually doesn't," she said softly. "But I understand why you did it." The daycare worker left the room, muttering something about her contract not covering this. Arya didn't watch her go. She was watching Luca's fists slowly unclench. In the doorway, unseen by anyone, Mr. Ferretti stood with his mouth slightly open. He had interviewed 53 candidates. Not one of them had lasted this long without either crying, threatening to leave, or attempting to bribe the children with candy within the first 10 minutes. This woman had been in the room for 6 minutes. She was still on the floor. Marco had crawled into her lap without seeming to notice he'd done it. And for the first time in 11 months, the children's floor of the Rossetti mansion was quiet, not the silence of fear, but the fragile, precious silence of children who have paused, just for a moment, to see if maybe, this one might be different. The first week was war. Arya had expected it. She had prepared for it the way a sailor prepares for a storm they can see on the horizon, not with the hope that it won't come, but with the steady, quiet knowledge that they have survived storms before. Luca's campaign against her was systematic and, she had to admit privately, impressively organized for a 4-year-old. He hid her shoes. He poured orange juice into her bag when she wasn't looking. He told her, with complete seriousness, on the second morning, that she smelled like poverty. She had to turn away for a moment when he said that, not to hide hurt, though it did sting, but to hide a smile, because she recognized the borrowed cruelty of those words. He had heard that from somewhere, and he was testing whether it would make her leave the way the others had. She turned back around and said, "You might be right. I don't have much. But I'm still here." He threw his breakfast on the floor. She cleaned it up without a word. He watched her clean it up. Something flickered across his face, confusion, frustration, and the tiniest, most unwilling seed of something else. He didn't understand why she wasn't crying. Why she wasn't threatening him. Why she wasn't doing the tight-lipped, stiff-shouldered performance of professional patience that always cracked eventually. She wasn't performing. That was the thing he didn't have a framework for yet. Sophia expressed her warfare differently. She was 3, and 3 is the age of pure emotional intensity with no filter and no mercy. She would scream without warning, long, piercing, devastating screams. At any moment she felt Arya getting too close. Not just physically. If Arya said something kind, Sophia screamed. If Arya smiled at her, Sophia screamed. It was as though kindness itself had become a threat, because kindness was what she had lost, and wanting it meant risking the unbearable pain of losing it again. Arya understood this more deeply than she could explain to anyone. She had spent a year after Giada's father left doing the same thing, pushing away anyone who tried to help, because hope, after it has been murdered, is the most terrifying thing you can be offered. So she didn't force closeness with Sophia. She worked alongside her instead. When Sophia was in the playroom, Arya sat nearby and did quiet things, folded small squares of paper, hummed to herself, occasionally said something not directed at Sophia at all, just said it into the air. I wonder what shape a cloud would be if it could choose. Simple, strange, open things that weren't demands or questions or expectations. On the 4th day, Sophia sat down 3 feet away from her and said nothing. On the 5th day, it was 2 feet. She didn't speak. She just sat closer. Arya kept folding paper. She hummed a little louder. Marco was the most straightforward and the most heartbreaking. He was 2. His needs were simple and enormous. He wanted to be held. He wanted to be seen. He wanted someone to notice him and not look away. He would cling to Arya's leg and then, when she bent down to pick him up, panic would shoot across his face and he would push her away hard. Come close. Go away. Come close. Go away. The rhythm of a child who has learned that being held means being dropped. Arya learned to wait. She would sit on the floor and open her arms and wait. She did not move toward him. She let him decide. Sometimes he would toddle over and press his small face into her neck and hold on so tightly it made her chest ache. Sometimes he would just stand 3 feet away and stare at her arms and not come. She kept them open anyway. Every evening, Arya went home to her own daughter, little Giada, with her gap-toothed smile and her collection of rocks she called her treasure, and she sat on the edge of their bed in the leaking apartment, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to the marrow. Not just the physical exhaustion of chasing 3 small, determined children all day. The emotional weight of holding space for that much pain. Of being steady for 3 people who were trying their absolute hardest to break her. But she went back every morning. On the 6th day, something shifted. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Arya had been trying to get Marco to nap. He was overtired and miserable, fighting sleep with the grim determination only toddlers possess, when she heard it from Luca's room. A sound that stopped her completely. Crying. Real crying. Not the performative, weaponized crying designed to manipulate or punish. The kind that comes from somewhere a child doesn't mean to let you hear. The raw, terrible crying of a 4-year-old boy who misses his mother so much it lives in his body like a sickness. She stood outside his door for a moment. In her arms, Marco had finally fallen asleep, his small weight against her chest like a warm stone. She knocked softly. No answer, but the crying got quieter. He was trying to stop, trying to hide it, the way boys are taught to do far too young. She opened the door slowly. Luca was on his bed, face buried in a pillow that still, after 2 years, had one of Elena's old scarves tied around it. He had put it there himself when he was 2 and nobody had been able to take it away from him. Arya sat on the edge of his bed. She didn't say anything. She didn't touch him. After a long minute, Luca's muffled voice came from the pillow, "I'm not crying." "I know," Arya said. Another minute passed. "Do you miss your mama?" Luca asked the pillow. He was asking about her, about whether Arya had one, whether anyone ever felt this way. "Yes," Arya said. "Every day." Luca's hand crept sideways across the blanket until it found her hand. He didn't look up. He just held on. In the hallway, through the cracked door, Sophia sat with her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, listening. A tear moved down her cheek. She wiped it away fiercely with the back of her hand. But she stayed. They all stayed. That was what they were learning, not that the world was safe, but that someone could be steady inside the unsafeness. That someone could sit in the dark with you and not run from it. At the other end of the mansion, in a room full of security screens and strategy maps, a 40-second message alert pinged on Dante Rossetti's phone. It was from the camera monitoring the children's floor. He looked at it for a long time, the image of Luca's hand finding areas on the blanket, of Marco sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. He told himself he felt nothing. He was very practiced at telling himself that. His hand, when he set the phone down, was not entirely steady. The mansion had a kitchen the size of most people's entire apartments, and it had been used, for the last 2 years, almost exclusively by professional catering staff. Nobody cooked in it. Nobody lingered in it. It gleamed with the sterile, unused beauty of a room that had forgotten what it was for. On a Saturday morning at the end of Arya's second week, that changed. She had arrived early, before the formal start of her shift, because Giada had woken at dawn with a small fever and Arya had spent 2 hours in that particular state of terror that belongs only to parents, measuring temperature, checking breathing, making decisions, until the fever broke and Giada fell back to sleep. Mrs. Benedetti was with her. She was safe. But Arya's heart was still running fast when she arrived at the mansion, and she needed something to do with her hands. She went to the kitchen. She found flour. She found eggs. She found butter and sugar and vanilla and the kind of organized abundance that only exists when someone has everything and enjoys none of it. And she began to make something she had been making since she was 8 years old, when her own mother had taught her, standing on a step stool to reach the counter, Siam. Simple Italian ring cookies with a soft, yielding texture and a sweetness that was never too much. She didn't think about who might smell them. She was just making something with her hands because her heart needed it. The first person to appear in the kitchen doorway was Marco, dragged there by his nose and his 2-year-old complete absence of self-regulation. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas, hair wild, stuffed rabbit under one arm, staring at the sight of someone cooking in the kitchen with the wide-eyed wonder of someone encountering a myth made real. Arya glanced at him. "Good morning. Do you want to help?" He was at her side in 4 seconds. She stood him on a step stool. She gave him a wooden spoon. She showed him how to stir, slowly, then faster, and she held his small hand inside hers to guide the movement, and the whole world contracted to the warm circle of a kitchen and a child learning something good. Sophia appeared in the doorway 5 minutes later, trying to look as though she had not been standing there for 4 minutes deciding whether to come in. She walked in very casually, stood on the other side of Arya, and without a word, picked up the extra wooden spoon. Arya handed her a bowl of her own. Luca was last, and he came in with his hands in his pockets and his chin up, with the supreme dignity of a 4-year-old who absolutely did not want to be seen wanting this. He took one look at his younger siblings covered in flour dust, and his expression did something complicated, something that lasted less than a second before the armor came back up. "Baking is for babies," he announced. "That's interesting," Arya said, not turning around. "Because it's actually chemistry. The flour and the egg proteins form a structure, and the butter makes it tender, and the heat causes a reaction that changes everything. It's basically science." She paused. "But you don't have to help if you don't want to." There was a pause. Luca pulled out the 3rd step stool. An hour later, the kitchen looked like a flour bomb had detonated in it. Marco had sugar in his hair. Sophia had accidentally cracked an egg on the floor and was staring at it with the expression of someone waiting to be yelled at. And Luca had his tongue pressed between his teeth in pure concentration as he pressed the Siam rings into shape, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that mansion could remember, he looked exactly like what he was, a 4-year-old boy doing something he was proud of. It was Mr. Ferretti who heard the noise. And then the laughter. Sophia had knocked her bowl, and it was the first laugh that had been inside her in weeks, and he came to the kitchen doorway and stood there in his suit with his mouth slightly open. And then Dante came. Not because he'd been summoned. Not because anything was wrong. He'd been walking past, at 7 in the morning, still in his shirt with the sleeves rolled up, still holding a phone with a dozen unread messages, and the smell of baking had reached him and done something to his chest that he hadn't been prepared for. He stood in the kitchen doorway. His 3 children were covered in flour. They were standing on step stools around a woman he had not yet spoken a single word to, following her hands with their eyes, trying to do what she was doing, and there was noise, actual, alive, human noise, coming from his kitchen. Luca saw him first. The moment of openness on the boy's face flickered, the armor started to rise, and then something stopped it. Maybe because Arya was here. Maybe because the cookies were still in the oven and the world, right now, felt different. "Papa," Luca said, his voice small and uncertain and more a child's voice than it had been in 2 years. "We're doing science." Dante Rossetti stood there in his kitchen doorway. Something moved in his chest, something old and buried, something he had locked away on the day he stood at Elena's grave and decided that feeling things too much was a weakness he could not afford. He looked at Arya for the first time directly. She was looking at him, not with the frightened, shrinking look most people gave him, and not with the ambition or calculation he was used to seeing from people who wanted something. She was just looking at him. Simply. As though he were a person. "They did very well," she said. He didn't answer. He looked at his children for another long moment, and then he walked away, because walking away was the only thing he knew how to do with feelings that came too fast to armor himself against. But in the hallway, he stopped walking. He stood there with his back against the cold marble wall, and he pressed his hand flat against his sternum where the ache lived, and he closed his eyes. From the kitchen, through the closed door, he heard Luca laugh. He had not heard Luca laugh in over a year. Dante Rossetti, who had broken harder men than himself, pressed his hand harder against his chest and did not move for a very long time. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to powerful men. It is different from ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is knowing there is no one there. The loneliness of powerful men is knowing there are dozens of people around you and none of them see you. They see the power, the position, the fear you generate. They respond to what you can do to them. Never to what you are. Dante had not been truly seen since Elena. And he had decided, in the months after her death, that being seen was overrated. Being seen meant being vulnerable. Being vulnerable meant being breakable. And broken men lost empires. So he had locked every soft thing inside himself behind walls even thicker than the ones around his mansion. But children, as it turns out, don't care about your walls. He began watching Arya with the children the way he watched everything that mattered, carefully, analytically, from a distance, telling himself it was strategic. He had cameras. He reviewed the footage. Professional interest only. Making sure the children were safe. That was what he told himself at midnight when he was watching footage of Arya reading to all three of them at once, Marco in her lap, Sophia pressed against her left side, Luca lying on his stomach with his chin in his hands pretending he was not enchanted, while Arya's voice wove through the air with a story she was clearly making up as she went, pulling their requests in as she went. And then the dragon who was afraid of fire met the knight who was afraid of swords. Luca had giggled. Dante had not heard that sound in so long that he'd had to replay the footage 3 times. He told himself it was professional. He was lying to himself. Things between Dante and Arya were still formal, still distant. They exchanged brief words when necessary, updates on the children, logistics, schedules. She did not look at him with fear. She did not look at him with the calculated warmth of someone building a relationship for strategic purposes. She just looked at him. That simple, direct, infuriatingly unself-conscious gaze. It made him feel clumsy in his own skin, which was a sensation he had not experienced since adolescence and did not appreciate experiencing now. The moment that cracked something important happened on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week. He came to the children's floor late, intending to briefly check on them before a night call with associates overseas. He expected to find them asleep. Instead, he found the hallway light on, and through the cracked door of Luca's room, he heard voices. Luca, but she died. She died and she didn't come back. Arya, quietly, no. She didn't come back. Luca, and you could die too. And Miss Arya could die. And Papa could die. Arya, yes. People we love can die. That's real, and I won't pretend it isn't. A long silence. Luca, then what's the point? Dante's hand went to the wall. Arya's answer came slowly, like she was finding the words from somewhere true. The point is the love itself. The love doesn't die when the person does, Luca. It doesn't go anywhere. Your mama's love for you, it's still here. It's in you. Every good thing she taught you and every time she held you, that's still in your body. It's still in you. Death takes people. It doesn't take love. The silence that followed was long and full. Luca, how do you know? Arya, because I have lost people too. And I still feel them. Luca, did it stop hurting? Arya, no. But it changed. It went from something sharp that cut me all the time to something heavy that I carry, and sometimes the heavy thing is also warm. Because it means I loved someone enough to miss them that much. In the hallway, Dante Rossetti's eyes were burning. He had not let himself cry since the funeral, not once, not in private, not with the lights off. He had been so certain that if he started he would not be able to stop, and he could not afford to break down. The children needed him functional. The empire needed him sharp. What he had not understood was that there is a difference between functional and present. He had been functional. He had been building walls so high that his children, reaching up from the other side, could not find his hands. He did not go in. He could not go in, not like this, not raw and undone in a hallway. He walked to his office, and he sat in the dark with his elbows on his desk and his face in his hands. He thought about the last time he had put Luca to bed himself. He could not remember. He thought about the last time he had sat on the floor with Marco. He could not remember. He thought about the last time Sophia had been held by someone who wasn't paid to hold her, and his chest hurt so badly he had to press his fist against it to breathe. He had been so afraid to love them more and then lose them too, the way he had lost Elena, that he had already lost them. He had been so afraid of grief that he had guaranteed more of it. The next morning, he came to the children's floor at 7, not in his suit, not with his phone, but in the simple dark shirt and pants he'd been wearing when he'd finally fallen asleep at 3, and he stood in the doorway of the playroom. Arya looked up from where she was sitting with Marco, building a block tower. Her expression did not change, no alarm, no performance. Just acknowledgement. "Do you need something?" she asked. "No." He came into the room. He sat down, cross-legged, on the floor near Marco. It had been so long since he'd sat on a floor that his body felt strange doing it. Marco looked at him with the serious, evaluating gaze of a toddler uncertain about intentions. Then Marco picked up a block and held it out to him. Dante took it. His throat was tight. He put it on the tower. Marco patted it approvingly. Arya watched this from across the room, and she said nothing, and she did not make it a big thing, and that was exactly right. She just turned back to handing Marco blocks, including Dante in the quiet orbit of it without ceremony. Luca appeared in the doorway 15 minutes later. He stared at his father on the floor. Dante looked up at his son. 4 years old, with that small scar on his chin and the dark eyes that looked too old. "Come help," Dante said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Luca came. He sat next to his father, and their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. It was not a healed thing. It was a beginning. A small, fragile, enormously important beginning. Arya watched the tower grow, and the warmth behind her eyes was very difficult to blink away. Love, when it is real and deep and rooted in something honest, is not comfortable. It does not arrive as sunlight arriving into a clean room. It arrives the way spring arrives after a very long winter, messy, disruptive, accompanied by mud and sudden rain, breaking open frozen things that had learned to be closed. By the end of the 4th week, the Rossetti mansion was different. Not transformed, it was not a fairy tale where everything becomes golden overnight. But something was moving inside the walls. You could feel it, the way you can feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. The children had not become easy. Luca still had hard days when the grief came back like a tide and he broke things and said sharp words. Sophia still sometimes retreated into herself so completely that she was physically present but entirely elsewhere. Marco still cried in the night. But they had stopped trying to drive Arya away. That was the tectonic thing. The decision, made separately by each of them, in their own time, in their own quiet way, to stop protecting themselves from her. Sophia made her decision on a Wednesday morning with no preamble. She walked up to Arya while Arya was making the beds, pressed her small face into Arya's stomach, and wrapped her arms around her. She said nothing. She just held on. Arya held her back. She pressed her lips to the top of Sophia's head. She did not say anything either, because Sophia had not asked for words. She had asked for this, for contact, for warmth, for the simple and enormous fact of being held without an agenda. They stood like that for a long time. After that, Sophia talked. Not just sharp words, not just weapons. She talked the way a child should, endless questions about clouds and whether fish slept and why some flowers were different colors and what happened when you died and whether her mama could see her from wherever she was now. Arya answered every question. For the last one, she said, I think love finds ways to see what it loves. I really do. Sophia considered this with the gravity of a 3-year-old engaging with a significant theological proposition. Then she said, okay, and went back to playing, apparently satisfied. It was around this same time that Dante stopped pretending his interest in Arya was professional. He didn't examine it too closely, he was not ready for that, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. But he found reasons to be in the same rooms. He found himself, at dinner, asking about her day, not the children's day, hers. He found himself listening to her answers with the complete focus he usually reserved for things that could cost him power or blood, and she was talking about ordinary things, a book she was reading, a thing Giada had said, the way the light came in through the kitchen window in the afternoon. Ordinary things. He had forgotten that ordinary things could hold so much. She did not flirt. She was not angling for anything. When their eyes met, she did not look away shyly or look away with professional distance, she just met his gaze steadily, and sometimes something warm moved through it, and she let it be there without trying to manage it or weaponize it. He was not accustomed to people who didn't want something from him. He was not accustomed to being simply, quietly, respected. One evening he found her on the children's floor long after her shift, sitting outside Marco's door because he'd woken from a nightmare and cried himself back to sleep, but she'd been unwilling to leave until she was certain he was fully settled. She was sitting against the wall in the hallway with her knees drawn up, her head leaning back, clearly exhausted, with that particular peaceful tired expression of someone who has given everything and has no regrets about it. Your shift ended 2 hours ago, he said. She looked up at him. I know. He was upset. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Simple. Not challenging. Just true. He stood there in the hallway. He should say something useful, practical, managerial. He had a whole vocabulary for those kinds of interactions. Instead, what came out was, I don't know how you do it. She looked at him for a moment, and in her eyes there was no performance of modesty or deflection. I just stay, she said. That's all it is, really. I just don't leave. He sat down on the floor against the opposite wall. 2 adults in a hallway, sitting on the floor in the quiet, and neither of them moved to change it. I've been leaving, he said. He didn't know he was going to say it until it was out. Not physically. But I've been absent. Yes, she said, without judgment. Not cruelty, not absolution. Just acknowledgement. I didn't know how to be with them and still be, he stopped. Still be intact, she offered. Yes. You don't have to be intact to be present, she said. They don't need you intact. They need you there. With your actual heart, not your armor. He was quiet for a long time. Down the hall, Marco made a small sound in his sleep. Both of them turned toward the sound instinctively, then back. You're not afraid of me, he said. Should I be? He thought about this honestly. Everyone is. People fear what they can't read, she said. I think I can read you well enough. She tilted her head. You're a man who's terrified of losing anyone else he loves, so you've decided not to love too visibly. It's not complicated. He felt the truth of that like a hand pressing directly on the bruise. He looked at her. My daughter's father left when she was 8 months old, she said. Just left. And I spent a year thinking if I closed everything off I'd be safe. If I didn't need anything from anyone, nothing could hurt me. She paused. But Giada needed me open. She needed to see me love things, trust things, feel things. Children can't learn to be alive from parents who are performing numbness. The hallway was very quiet. You came here for a job, he said. Yes. And you found 3 children who needed someone to stay. She met his eyes. And maybe their father did too. He said nothing. But he did not look away. It was Luca who said it first, and he said it the way 4-year-olds say true things, without planning, without ceremony, without any awareness of the earthquake he was causing. It was a Sunday, 6 weeks after Aria's arrival, and it was one of those mornings that come rarely and must be received gently when they do, the kind where the light through the windows is golden and soft, where everyone woke up in a good mood without any particular reason, where the world has decided to rest from its usual difficulty for a few hours. They were all in the kitchen again, it had become theirs, that kitchen. A Sunday ritual, flour and eggs and the radio on low and all of them together in the mess and warmth of making something. Dante was there now every Sunday without being asked. He had learned, under Aria's patient and entirely non-instructional guidance, that learning to roll dough with his children was not a skill beneath him. He had learned that Marco's face when he successfully held the rolling pin was one of the most important things he had ever seen. Giada was there too on Sundays, Aria's small daughter, 4 years old and gap-toothed and fearless, who had arrived into the mansion's world and immediately claimed it as her own natural habitat. She and Luca had developed an alliance based on mutual curiosity and a shared interest in feeding the kitchen scraps to an imaginary dog they had collaboratively invented and named Professor Biscuit. So there they all were, Dante and Aria on opposite sides of the kitchen island, 3 Rossetti children at various stages of creating culinary chaos, and Giada sitting on the counter, which Aria had technically said not to do, dictating instructions to Marco that he could not possibly understand but was listening to with total seriousness. Luca was pressing cookies with a cutter shaped like a star. He was focused the way he got focused on things he loved, the armor completely gone, just a boy making something, his tongue between his teeth. He held up a star. He looked at it. He looked at Aria. Miss Aria, he said. He considered his star cookie for another moment. Can you be our mama? The kitchen went quiet. Not the terrible silence, the tender one. The one that meant something important had landed in the room and everyone was holding very still so it wouldn't break. Marco stopped stirring. Sophia looked up. Giada, from her perch on the counter, went wide-eyed with the instinct that something enormous was happening. Aria looked at Luca. Her hands, which had been dusted with flour, went still on the counter. She looked at this boy, this small, fierce, complicated, finally beginning to unfold boy, and her eyes filled. She did not answer immediately. She came around the counter, and she knelt in front of him, and she took his flour-covered hands in her flour-covered hands. Luca, she said, and her voice was very soft and very steady. Do you know what that would mean to me? He shook his head. His chin was starting to wobble. It would mean everything, she said. Everything in the whole world. Sophia slid off her stool and came to stand beside her brother. Marco abandoned his bowl and toddled over and pressed himself against Aria's side. And Aria held all 3 of them at once, her arms around a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old who were pressing their faces into her and holding on the way people hold on when they've been at sea for a very long time and have finally found solid ground. She looked up over their heads. Dante was standing on the other side of the kitchen island. He had not moved. His hands were flat on the counter. His face was open. Completely, devastatingly open in a way she had never seen it, in a way perhaps no one had seen it since Elena, all the layers stripped back by the sight of his children choosing, freely and fully and with their whole hearts, to love someone. His eyes met hers. In his eyes was everything, grief and gratitude and something newer, something that had been growing in him for 6 weeks and that he had not let himself name yet because naming it required a courage that had nothing to do with empires or enemies and was therefore the most frightening courage he had ever been asked for. Giada, who had been watching all of this from the counter with enormous eyes, said very clearly, "My mama is the best mama. She's very good at staying." It broke the moment open like a window being thrown wide, everyone exhaled, and Luca made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and Arya laughed too with tears on her face, and Marco started clapping because everyone else seemed happy and that was enough reason for him. Later, when the cookies were in the oven and the children were in the living room engaged in a solemn ceremony involving Professor Biscuit, Dante found Arya at the kitchen sink. He stood beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was the easy kind, the kind between people who have stopped needing to fill it. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "I have spent 2 years building walls around everything I loved because I couldn't survive losing it again." He looked at his hands on the sink. "And I convinced myself that was protection. That it was intelligence. That it was strength. It's what makes sense when you're in that much pain," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "But you walked in here with nothing, no power, no money, nowhere near enough reason to stay, and you stayed. You stayed for children who tried their absolute hardest to drive you out. You gave them everything you had." His jaw tightened. "You gave them back to me." She shook her head. "They were always yours. They just needed someone to show them it was safe to love you." He turned to face her fully. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she had heard it. "I am not an easy man. I know. I have a complicated life. I've done things. I know," she said again. Not naive. Not dismissing it. Just, steady. "And yet," he said, and there was something in those 2 words, something he was asking and offering at the same time. "And yet," she agreed. He reached out and touched her face, one hand, gently, at her jaw, and she leaned into it very slightly, the way people lean into warmth they have been cold without for a very long time. "The children were right," he said. "You should stay." "Is that what you want, or what they want?" she asked. "Both," he said. "Both. It's both." She covered his hand with hers. She looked up at him, and her eyes were clear and warm and certain, the eyes of a woman who had survived enough to know the difference between fear dressed as love and actual love. "Then I'll stay." In the living room, Luca's voice floated back to them, stern and authoritative, informing the invisible Professor Biscuit that sitting on the furniture was against the rules but that exceptions could be made on Sundays. Sophia said, "Sundays don't count, everybody knows that." Marco said, very seriously, "Boo." The kitchen filled with that sound that had been missing from the mansion for 2 years, laughter. Real, unguarded, unearned, unmistakable. The sound of a house becoming a home. Arya Conti had come to this mansion with nothing, no money, no connections, no power to protect herself, only a heart that had been broken and therefore knew exactly the shape of brokenness in others. She had come for a job that would let her feed her daughter tomorrow. She had stayed because 3 small people needed someone to show them that staying was possible. That love, once given, did not always abandon. That the world could hold warmth even after it had held so much cold. And in staying, in that simple, daily, costly, luminous act of simply staying, she had given back to a father his children, to 3 children their laughter, and to a mansion its heartbeat. Because sometimes the people who have nothing are the ones who give everything. And sometimes the bravest thing in the world is not an empire, not a fortress, not a wall built high enough to keep grief out. The bravest thing in the world is an open door. And a woman who walks through it.